The distant thunder of hooves on parched earth broke the dawn's silence as Abigail Summers stared at the cloud of dust on the horizon, a sinking feeling in her stomach that the approaching riders would change everything. The year was 1878, and life in Nogales, Arizona Territory, was as unforgiving as the desert sun that beat down relentlessly on the small border town. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the heat, her knuckles white against the wooden railing of her father's modest ranch house. Only yesterday, she'd been told she would be married within the month to Harold Fletcher, the banker's son, a man who looked at her like she was another asset to acquire. "They're coming earlier than expected," came her father's gruff voice behind her. Thomas Summers had been a different man before consumption took his wife 3 years ago. Now, at 56, he was withered and desperate, gambling debts piling as high as the nearby mountains. "I know," Abigail replied, not turning to face him. At 22, she'd resigned herself to the marriage that would save her father's ranch. Her golden brown hair fell loose down her back, free for perhaps one of the last times. Harold Fletcher preferred everything about a woman to be tightly bound and controlled. The riders grew closer, and Abigail could make out 5 men. Harold rode at the front, his posture stiff even on horseback. The others were his father and what appeared to be hired guns protection in these lawless parts. "Get yourself presentable," her father muttered, turning back into the house. "They'll expect to be fed." Abigail lingered a moment longer, watching as a lone rider approached from the opposite direction. The figure moved with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, unhurried despite the looming dust cloud of Fletcher's party. Something about the solitary rider made her pause, a strange premonition, perhaps before she hurried inside to change her dress. By the time the Fletcher party arrived, Abigail had donned her best dress, a modest blue cotton affair that had been her mother's. She'd secured her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck and pinched her cheeks for color. The lone rider she'd spotted had disappeared from view, and she wondered if she'd imagined him altogether. "Miss Summers," Harold Fletcher greeted with a curt nod as he dismounted. At 30, he was not unattractive with his carefully trimmed mustache and expensive Eastern clothes, but his eyes were cold, calculating. "Mr. Fletcher," she replied with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What a surprise to see you so early. We weren't expecting you until next week." "Business waits for no man," interjected Edward Fletcher, Harold's father and owner of the only bank in Nogales. "And neither does a wedding, I suppose." The older Fletcher's gaze swept over the modest ranch with poorly disguised disdain. The Summers property wasn't much 100 acres with a small herd of cattle and a struggling vegetable garden, but it was strategically located near a year-round water source, which made it valuable beyond its appearance. "Come inside, gentlemen," Thomas Summers said, appearing at the door. "Abigail has prepared refreshments." As the men filed into the house, Abigail noticed movement by the corral. The lone rider had arrived and was speaking with Miguel, their elderly ranch hand. The stranger wore dusty riding clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. There was something in his casual stance that contrasted sharply with the rigid formality of the Fletcher party. Inside, the conversation was all business. Edward Fletcher spread papers across the dining table, speaking in the measured tones of a man accustomed to getting his way. "As discussed, Thomas, the marriage contract includes the assumption of your debts, all $15,000 of them, and provides a comfortable allowance for both you and your daughter." Thomas Summers nodded, avoiding his daughter's gaze. They both knew the comfortable allowance was little more than hush money to keep the old man from interfering in Fletcher's real goal, the water rights. "And the wedding?" Thomas asked, his voice hollow. "We've moved it forward," Harold replied, glancing at Abigail. "This Sunday. 4 days." Abigail couldn't help the shock in her voice. "That's hardly enough time to prepare." Harold's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My father has business in Santa Fe the following week. Besides, what's there to prepare? The church is booked, your dress is being made in town, and the contracts are ready to sign today." Abigail felt the walls closing in. 4 days, just 4 days of freedom remaining. A knock at the door interrupted the tense silence. Miguel entered, hat in hand, his weathered face apologetic. "Senor Summers, forgive the interruption. A man has arrived with cattle you might want to see." Thomas frowned. "We're not expecting any cattle deliveries. He says it's about the debt, senor." The mention of debt caused Edward Fletcher to raise an eyebrow. "What debt would this be, Thomas?" "I was under the impression our arrangement covered all your obligations." Thomas stood, clearly flustered. "It must be a mistake. Excuse me, gentlemen. Abigail, serve our guests some coffee." As Thomas followed Miguel outside, Abigail busied herself with the coffee pot, grateful for something to do with her trembling hands. Through the kitchen window, she observed her father approaching the stranger, whose face she still couldn't see clearly from this angle. The men exchanged words, and her father's body language shifted from defensive to shocked. After several minutes of conversation, Thomas gestured toward the house, and the stranger tied his horse to the hitching post. When they entered, the atmosphere in the room changed immediately. The stranger removed his hat, revealing a face bronzed by the sun and eyes the color of a summer storm gray with hints of blue. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 or so, with dark hair that curled slightly where it met his collar. A thin scar ran along his jawline, and his expression remained neutral as he surveyed the room. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice strained, "this is Mr. Vaughn Keller. He claims to hold markers on my debt to Jack Holloway." Edward Fletcher's face darkened. "Holloway, the gambler from Tucson." "You borrowed from him." Thomas looked as if he'd aged another decade in the span of minutes. It was a desperate time. The stranger Vaughn spoke for the first time, his voice deep and steady. "Mr. Summers owed Holloway $5,000. I won the debt in a poker game last month in Tombstone. I've come to collect." "Impossible," Edward Fletcher snapped. "We have an agreement that covers all of Summers' debts." "Not this one," Vaughn replied evenly. "This debt wasn't disclosed, was it, Mr. Summers?" Thomas couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Abigail felt sick. Another debt, one large enough to buy a small ranch outright, and her father had hidden it. Edward Fletcher stood abruptly. "This changes the terms of our agreement. If there are undisclosed debts, the contract must be renegotiated." "Father," Harold interjected, his gaze fixed on Abigail, "let's not be hasty. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement with Mr. Keller." Vaughn Keller leaned against the doorframe, seemingly unbothered by the tension. "I'm a reasonable man. I didn't ride all this way for nothing, but I'm open to discussion." Abigail watched the exchange with growing unease. These men were haggling over her future as if she were livestock at auction. Her father, broken and ashamed, the Fletchers calculating their losses, and this stranger whose arrival had upset their careful plans. "What do you propose, Mr. Keller?" Harold asked, his tone carefully neutral. Vaughn's gaze shifted to Abigail for the first time, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. Not appraisal like Harold's look, but something deeper, a recognition perhaps. "I propose a fair competition," Vaughn said, returning his attention to the men. "Mr. Fletcher seems set on acquiring this ranch for its water rights. I'm interested in recovering my money. Let's settle it like gentlemen." "What sort of competition?" Thomas asked warily. "A horse race," Vaughn replied. "From here to the border monument and back." If Fletcher wins, I'll sell him the debt for $1 if I win. He paused and his gaze flickered toward Abigail again. I'll take payment in another form. The ranch? Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. No, Vaughn said quietly. The wedding. The room fell silent. Abigail felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath her. Harold Fletcher's face contorted with rage. This is preposterous. You can't wager a woman. I'm not wagering Miss Summers, Vaughn interrupted calmly. I'm wagering the right to marry her, which seems to be what you've purchased along with this land. Unless, of course, the lady has a different preference altogether. All eyes turned to Abigail, who stood frozen, coffee pot still in hand. She began, unsure what to say. Marriage to a stranger who'd won her in a poker game, or marriage to a cold man who saw her as nothing but a means to acquire land. What choice was that? I have no preference, she finally said, her voice hollow. It seems my fate was decided the moment my father started gambling. Her words hung in the air, sharp with truth. Thomas flinched as if struck. The race will be tomorrow at dawn, Vaughn said, breaking the tense silence. Do we have an agreement, gentlemen? Edward Fletcher looked ready to refuse, but Harold placed a restraining hand on his father's arm. We agree, Harold said, his eyes cold as he looked at Vaughn. And when I win, you'll leave Nogales and never return. Fair enough, Vaughn replied with a slight nod. He placed his hat back on his head and turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at Abigail. Miss Summers, might I have a word with you? Outside. Before she could respond, Harold stepped forward. Anything you have to say to my fiancée can be said in my presence. Vaughn's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flashed in his eyes. I believe the lady can make that decision for herself. Abigail set down the coffee pot, her heart racing. It's all right, Mr. Fletcher. I'll speak with Mr. Keller on the porch. Harold's jaw tightened, but he didn't object further. Abigail followed Vaughn outside, aware of the eyes watching through the window. They stopped at the edge of the porch, far enough from the house for privacy but still within view. Miss Summers, Vaughn said quietly, I apologize for involving you in this situation. Do you? She replied, surprising herself with her boldness. You just wagered my future on a horse race. That hardly seems like the action of a man concerned with my feelings. He studied her for a moment, then smiled a genuine smile that transformed his face. You're right, of course. But I wonder if you've considered that I might be offering you a choice. A choice between two strangers who see me as property. How generous. No, he said, his voice dropping lower. A choice to make your own decision eventually. Abigail frowned. I don't understand. Vaughn glanced toward the house, then back at her. Your father's debt to Jack Holloway is real. I do hold the marker, but I didn't come here to collect it, not exactly. He paused. I came because I received a letter from Miguel. Miguel? Abigail's eyes widened. Our ranch hand. Why would he write to you? We served together briefly in the war before I headed west. He's been worried about your situation with the Fletchers. He wrote that your father was being forced into an arrangement that would leave you married to a man who cares more for water rights than for you. Abigail's mind raced. Miguel had always been protective of her, especially since her mother's death, but she never imagined he would intervene like this. So you came to rescue me, she asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. Why? What do you gain, truthfully? Vaughn's gaze was steady. Nothing immediately, but Fletcher has been buying up water rights across the territory, damming streams and charging ranchers for access. It's destroying livelihoods. Someone needs to stop him. And that someone is you. Abigail wasn't sure whether to believe him or not. No, he said softly. That someone might be you, Miss Summers, if you had control of your own land. Before she could respond, the door opened and Harold Fletcher stepped onto the porch. Your time is up, Keller, he said coldly. "We have contracts to sign." Vaughn nodded to Abigail. "Until tomorrow, Miss Summers." He turned and walked to his horse, mounting with the easy grace she'd noticed earlier. As he rode away, Abigail found herself watching his retreating figure with a mixture of confusion and something dangerously close to hope. For the first time in months, she felt as if she might have a say in her own destiny, even if that say came in the form of a mysterious stranger with unclear motives. Harold's hand closed around her arm, not painfully but firmly enough to remind her of his presence. "Come inside, Abigail. Don't let that drifter fill your head with nonsense. By this time tomorrow, he'll be long gone." Abigail allowed herself to be led back inside, but her thoughts remained with the gray-eyed stranger and his promise of choice. The night passed slowly for Abigail. After the Fletchers left with signed contracts and promises to return for the race at dawn, she'd confronted Miguel about his letter to Vaughn Keller. "Who is he really?" she demanded as they stood in the barn, away from her father's ears. Miguel smiled sadly, his weathered face creasing. "Senor Keller is a good man, Nina. He fought bravely in the war and has lived honorably since. When your mother was alive, he delivered horses to your father several times. You were younger then, perhaps you don't remember." Abigail frowned, searching her memory. "The horse trader from Colorado." "The one with the Appaloosas," Miguel nodded. "The same. He knows horses better than anyone I've ever met, and he knows the value of water in this territory. But why would he help us? Help me?" Miguel's gaze was steady. "Some men act from honor, Nina, and some—" He hesitated. "Some remember kindness shown to them in dark times." Abigail wanted to ask more, but her father called for Miguel, ending their conversation. She retired to her room, mind racing with questions and possibilities. Dawn arrived with a pink glow across the eastern sky. Abigail had barely slept, but she dressed carefully in a simple riding skirt and blouse. She wasn't participating in the race, but something told her this day would change her life irrevocably. By the time she stepped outside, riders were already gathering. Word had spread through Nogales about the race. Any excitement was welcome in the small town, and several onlookers had arrived to witness the event. The Fletchers were there, Harold astride his expensive thoroughbred, imported from Kentucky at great cost. The horse was beautiful, but seemed ill-suited to the harsh desert terrain. Vaughn Keller arrived moments later on a sturdy paint horse different from the mount he'd ridden yesterday. This animal moved with confident ease, its muscled body speaking of endurance rather than speed. "Interesting choice," Harold commented loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That animal looks better suited to pulling a plow than winning a race." Vaughn merely smiled, patting his horse's neck. "Desert Rose here has never pulled anything heavier than me, and she's never lost a long-distance race." Thomas Summers, looking even more haggard than the day before, stepped forward to explain the rules. "The course runs from here to the border monument south of town about 15 miles, and then back again. First rider to return wins." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The stakes are as agreed yesterday." Several onlookers murmured at this, and Abigail felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Everyone knew she was essentially the prize in this contest. "One more thing," Vaughn said, dismounting and approaching Thomas. "I'd like to make the terms of this race completely transparent." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a document which he handed to Thomas. "This is Jack Holloway's marker for your debt, $5,000. He then produced another paper. "And this is a deed transfer, already signed by me, that would give full ownership of this ranch to Miss Summers, not to you, Mr. Summers, and not to Fletcher in the event that I win this race." Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Harold Fletcher's face darkened with fury. "What game are you playing, Keller?" he demanded. "No game," Vaughn replied calmly. "Just making sure everyone understands what's at stake. If you win, you get the debt marker for $1 and proceed with your marriage as planned. If I win, the debt is forgiven, and Miss Summers becomes the legal owner of this property. Whether she chooses to marry either of us afterward would be entirely her decision." Abigail stared at Vaughn in shock. He was offering her freedom, complete ownership of the ranch, with no obligation to marry anyone. "This is absurd," Edward Fletcher sputtered. "The contracts are already signed. Contracts signed under duress and without full disclosure of debts are hardly binding," Vaughn interrupted. "I'm simply offering a clean resolution to a complicated situation." Thomas Summers looked torn between hope and despair. Abigail would own everything, the ranch, the water rights. "Everything," Vaughn confirmed, "free and clear." Edward Fletcher grabbed his son's arm, pulling him aside for a heated, whispered conversation. After a moment, Harold returned, his expression confident. "We accept your terms, Keller. It makes no difference. My thoroughbred will leave your farm horse in the dust." He smiled coldly. "And then Abigail will have the pleasure of choosing between a penniless drifter or a man who can provide her with security and position." Vaughn remounted his horse without responding to the taunt. The riders lined up at the makeshift starting line, a rope stretched between two fence posts while Thomas prepared to start the race. Abigail approached Vaughn's horse, looking up at him with confusion and gratitude warring in her expression. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. He looked down at her, his gray eyes serious. "Because some debts can never be repaid with money, Miss Summers, and because everyone deserves the right to choose their own path." He nodded toward Harold. "Even if that path leads to him." Before she could respond, Thomas raised his arm. "Riders ready." Vaughn settled into his saddle, eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the trail disappeared into the desert. "Go!" Thomas shouted, dropping his arm. The horses leapt forward, Harold's thoroughbred immediately taking the lead with powerful strides. Vaughn's paint horse maintained a steady pace, not rushing, seemingly untroubled by falling behind. As the dust settled and the riders disappeared from view, Abigail felt a strange calm settle over her. For the first time in months, she had hoped not for rescue by a handsome stranger, but for the chance to rescue herself. The crowd dispersed to await the racers' return, but Abigail remained at the starting line, her eyes fixed on the trail where the men had disappeared. Whatever happened today, she knew her life would never be the same. Hours passed slowly under the climbing sun. Most of the onlookers had sought shade, gathering under the old cottonwood tree near the corral or retreating to the ranch house porch. Abigail declined offers of refreshment, too anxious to eat or drink. Miguel brought her a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the sun and stood nearby, his presence a silent comfort. "He will win," Miguel said confidently after a long silence. "Senor Keller understands the desert." Fletcher's horse is fast but not suited for this terrain or distance. Abigail wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her. Fletcher's horse had such a lead, though, and Mr. Keller didn't seem to be pushing his mount at all. Miguel smiled. "That is why he will win." "The desert is not conquered with haste, Nina." Just as he finished speaking, a shout went up from one of the men who'd climbed to the roof of the barn for a better view. "Rider coming." Abigail's heart leapt to her throat as she strained to see through the heat haze. A single horse was approaching, moving at a steady canter. As it drew closer, the rider's identity became clear. Harold Fletcher, hunched forward in his saddle. His thoroughbred's once gleaming coat was now dull with sweat and dust. Thomas Summers moved to the finish line. tension visible in every line of his body. Edward Fletcher stood nearby, a satisfied smile on his thin lips. As Harold approached the final stretch, he urged his exhausted horse to a faster pace, clearly pushing the animal beyond its limits. The thoroughbred's gait was uneven, its breathing labored. They crossed the finish line to cheers from Fletcher's supporters, but Abigail could only stare at the horse's condition with dismay. Harold dismounted unsteadily, his own face red with exertion and sunburn. "Water," he gasped as one of his men rushed forward with a canteen. "Where's Keller?" Edward Fletcher asked, scanning the horizon. Harold took a long drink before answering. "Far behind. His horse was barely trotting when I passed him on the return journey." He smiled triumphantly at Abigail. "It seems your champion has failed, my dear." Abigail said nothing, her hopes crumbling. Miguel's hand touched her shoulder gently. "Wait," he murmured. "The race is not over." As if summoned by his words, another shout came from the lookout. "Second rider!" All eyes turned back to the trail. Vaughn Keller appeared, sitting tall in his saddle. His paint horse moved with the same steady rhythm as at the start, showing none of the exhaustion that had plagued Fletcher's mount. "Impossible," Harold muttered, his smile fading. Vaughn crossed the finish line minutes later, bringing his horse to a gentle stop. Unlike the thoroughbred, Desert Rose was sweaty but not overly distressed, her breathing returning to normal quickly. Vaughn dismounted smoothly and immediately offered his horse water, murmuring praise as she drank. "You lost, Keller," Harold said loudly, recovering his bravado. "Accept it gracefully and be on your way." Vaughn looked up, his expression neutral. "Did I? The race was to the border monument and back. I'm curious to know how you managed to make the round trip so quickly." A murmur ran through the crowd. Harold's face flushed deeper. "What are you implying?" "Nothing," Vaughn replied. "I'm simply asking a question. The monument is 15 miles south. That's 30 miles round trip. Even the fastest horse would take at least 3 hours to cover that distance in this heat. You returned in just over 2. Edward Fletcher stepped forward. "Are you accusing my son of cheating?" "I'm asking him to describe the monument," Vaughn said calmly. As proof, he reached the turning point. All eyes turned to Harold, whose confidence was visibly faltering. It's a stone marker," he stammered. "Everyone knows that." "What's carved on it?" Vaughn pressed. Harold's silence was damning. Vaughn reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small object, a wooden figure of an eagle, weather-worn but still recognizable. "This sits atop the monument," he explained, holding it up for all to see. "It was loose, so I removed it for safekeeping. I intended to notify the proper authorities about the needed repairs." He looked directly at Harold. "You never reached the monument, did you?" The crowd erupted in angry shouts and accusations. Edward Fletcher tried to quiet them, but the damage was done. Harold Fletcher had been caught in a blatant lie. Thomas Summers stepped forward, his expression torn between relief and anxiety. "The race terms were clear, to the monument and back, if Fletcher didn't complete the course. Then Keller wins by default," someone shouted from the crowd. Edward Fletcher's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "This proves nothing. That wooden trinket could have come from anywhere." "I placed men at the monument to observe the race," came a new voice. Sheriff Davis pushed through the crowd, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "They report that only one rider reached the turning point, Mr. Keller here. Fletcher never arrived." The truth laid bare. Harold Fletcher's deception crumbled. He looked to his father for support, but even Edward Fletcher seemed at a loss. Thomas Summers cleared his throat. "According to the terms agreed upon by all parties, Mr. Keller is the winner of this race. The debt marker is nullified, and—" He hesitated, glancing at his daughter. "Ownership of the Summers Ranch transfers to Miss Abigail Summers." A cheer went up from the crowd. Fletcher had few friends among the local ranchers, most of whom had suffered from his water rights acquisitions. Abigail stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened washing over her in waves. She was free. The ranch was hers. She owed nothing to anyone, not her father's debt, not a marriage of convenience. For the first time in her adult life, her future was entirely her own to determine. Vaughn approached her, leading his horse. Up close, she could see the fatigue in his eyes, though he hid it well. "Congratulations, Miss Summers," he said quietly. "The deed transfer is in your father's possession. Once it's registered with the county, everything will be legally yours." "I don't know how to thank you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, the expression warming his weather-worn face. "No thanks necessary. Miguel wrote that you were a woman of strong character caught in an impossible situation. He was right." He glanced toward the Fletchers, who were having a heated argument with the sheriff. "You might face some challenges from them legally, but with the sheriff as witness to today's events, I doubt they'll get far. Will you?" Abigail hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "Will you stay in Nogales for a while?" Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or hope. "I hadn't planned to. My business takes me north to Colorado soon." "Oh," she tried to hide her disappointment. "Of course, your horse trading business." Vaughn studied her face for a moment. "Miss Summers, Abigail," she interrupted. "Please call me Abigail." "Abigail," he repeated, her name soft on his lips. "I came here to repay an old debt and to help a friend. I didn't expect—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "The ranch will need attention. Your father's health isn't good. Would it be helpful if I stayed on for a time?" To assist with the transition, relief and something warmer flooded through her. "Yes," she said simply. "It would be very helpful." Their conversation was interrupted by Harold Fletcher, who stormed over, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," he spat. "My father won't let some drifter and a woman steal what's rightfully ours." Vaughn stepped slightly in front of Abigail, his posture relaxed but watchful. "Nothing was stolen, Fletcher. You lost fairly twice, actually. First by cheating in the race, then by trying to force a woman into marriage against her will." Harold's hand twitched toward his hip, where a pistol was holstered. "I wouldn't," Vaughn said quietly. "Sheriff Davis is still here, and I doubt he'd look kindly on you adding murder to your list of offenses today." Harold's gaze darted to the sheriff, who was indeed watching the exchange closely. With a final venomous look at both of them, Harold turned and stalked back to his father. "They'll cause trouble," Abigail murmured, watching the Fletchers depart. "Probably," Vaughn agreed. "But you're stronger than they know." He glanced at the sky, where the sun was beginning its westward descent. "I should tend to desert Rose and then speak with your father about arrangements." As he led his horse toward the barn, Abigail watched him go, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within her. Gratitude, certainly, and relief, but also something unexpected, a flutter of interest that had nothing to do with the ranch and everything to do with the man himself. She turned to find Miguel watching her, a knowing smile on his weathered face. "He is a good man, Nina," the old ranch hand said simply. "Yes," Abigail replied, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "I believe he is." The days that followed brought significant changes to the Summers ranch. Vaughn Keller proved to be as knowledgeable about cattle as he was about horses, helping to reorganize the struggling operation with efficient expertise. Thomas Summers, relieved of the burden of his gambling debts, seemed to rally briefly before taking to his bed with increasing frequency. The consumption that had claimed his wife now clearly taking hold in his lungs. Abigail found herself splitting her time between caring for her father and learning everything she could about running the ranch. Vaughn proved to be a patient teacher, explaining the complexities of water management, cattle breeding, and financial record keeping without condescension. True to Vaughn's prediction, Edward Fletcher attempted to contest the race results legally, filing a complaint with the territorial court. But with Sheriff Davis's testimony and multiple witnesses to Harold's cheating, the case was quickly dismissed. The Fletchers retreated to their bank in town, their influence in the area diminished but not eliminated. 2 weeks after the race, Abigail and Vaughn sat on the porch after dinner, the evening air still warm but pleasant. Thomas had retired early, his coughing worse than usual. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. "My father won't last the winter," Abigail said finally, giving voice to the knowledge they both shared but hadn't discussed. Vaughn nodded, his expression somber. "I'm sorry, Abigail, doctor. Havers says the disease has progressed too far for any treatment to help." "I know." She sighed, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders despite the mild temperature. "I've known since spring, really. That's why I agreed to marry Harold Fletcher. My father was desperate to see me settled before he died." "It was a selfless decision," Vaughn said quietly. "Was it, or was it cowardice? I was afraid of running this place alone." She gestured toward the darkened pastures. "I'm still afraid, if I'm honest." Vaughn was silent for a long moment. "Fear doesn't make you a coward. Acting in spite of fear makes you brave." He hesitated, then added, "And you won't be alone unless you choose to be. Miguel is devoted to this place, and there are hands who would return if there was steady work." "And you?" Abigail asked, the question escaping before she could consider its implications. "How much longer will you stay?" In the 2 weeks since the race, they developed an easy companionship that went beyond teacher and student. They'd shared meals and conversations, discovered common interests in books and music, and gradually learned each other's histories. Vaughn had fought for the Union during the war, been wounded at Gettysburg, and drifted west afterward, unable to settle back into his previous life in Pennsylvania. The horse trading had begun as a way to make a living, but had become a calling of sorts. What Vaughn hadn't explained was why Miguel's letter had prompted such an extraordinary response, riding hundreds of miles to help strangers, risking his reputation and possibly his life, in a contest with the powerful Fletcher family. "I should leave soon," he said, answering her question but not meeting her gaze. "The ranch is running smoothly now, and you've proven quite capable of managing the accounts and making business decisions." Disappointment settled heavily in Abigail's chest. "Of course. You have your own business to attend to," she forced a smile. "We're grateful for everything you've done, truly." Vaughn turned toward her, his expression hard to read in the gathering darkness. "Abigail, there's something I should explain about why I came here." "Miguel's letter," she prompted. "Yes, but—" He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd come to recognize as indicating discomfort. "Your mother saved my life once." Of all the things she'd expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. "My mother? How?" "It was during the war. I was part of a scouting party in Northern Virginia when we were ambushed. I took a bullet in the chest, should have been fatal, but it wasn't a direct hit. I managed to escape into the woods, but I was badly wounded, feverish. I stumbled onto a small farm where your parents were staying with relatives." Abigail's mind raced back. "The summer of '63, when we visited my mother's cousin near Manassas." Vaughn nodded. "Your father wanted to turn me over to Confederate authorities, understandably, given the risk to your family. But your mother refused. She was a nurse, trained in Baltimore." "I remember," Abigail whispered. "She treated injured men regardless of which side they fought for. My father argued with her about it constantly. She hid me in the root cellar for nearly 2 weeks, treating my wound, bringing me food and water when she could do so without detection. When I was strong enough to travel, she gave me civilian clothes and directions to Union lines. His voice grew soft with memory. The last thing she said to me was that someday I might have the chance to help someone else in desperate circumstances, and when that day came, I should remember that kindness is never wasted. Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes as she imagined her mother gentle, but fiercely determined, risking everything to save an enemy soldier. When Miguel's letter arrived describing your situation, I knew immediately what I had to do, Vaughn continued. I'd been searching for a way to repay your mother's kindness for 15 years. So that's why you came, Abigail said softly, to fulfill a debt to my mother. That's why I came, he acknowledged, but that's not why I stayed. The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Abigail's heart beat faster as she met his gaze, finding in it a warmth that had nothing to do with obligation or duty. "Why did you stay?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Instead of answering immediately, Vaughn rose from his chair and knelt before her, taking her hand in his. "I stayed because each day I spent with you made the thought of leaving more difficult. I stayed because your courage and intelligence and kindness reminded me of everything good I'd once believed in but had forgotten during years of wandering." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "I stayed because I was falling in love with you, Abigail Summers, and I didn't know how to stop." Abigail felt as if the world had tilted beneath her. In the aftermath of the race, she'd been so focused on securing her independence, on learning to manage the ranch, on caring for her father, that she'd barely allowed herself to acknowledge the growing feelings for Vaughn that had taken root in her heart. "I don't want you to stop," she whispered, her free hand reaching to touch his face. "I don't want you to leave." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. When she responded with quiet eagerness, it deepened into something more profound, a promise, a beginning. When they finally broke apart, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "I should speak with your father," he murmured. "Tomorrow," Abigail replied. "Let's not disturb him tonight." She hesitated, then added, "Besides, I'm not offering marriage, Vaughn Keller. Not yet." He drew back slightly, surprised, then smiled as understanding dawned. "No, no," she confirmed. "I've only just gained my independence. I intend to enjoy it for a while." His smile widened. "Fair enough, Miss Summers. What are you offering then?" "Time," she said simply. "Time for us to know each other better. Time for me to be certain that any choice I make is truly mine and not born of fear or gratitude." Vaughn nodded, his expression serious but his eyes warm. "I can accept those terms. I've waited 15 years to repay a debt. I can certainly wait for you to be sure of your heart." He rose and helped her to her feet, and they stood together in the quiet darkness, the future stretching before them, uncertain but full of possibility. The weeks stretched into months, and autumn arrived in the high desert, bringing cooler nights and golden light across the landscape. Thomas Summers's health continued to decline, but more slowly than expected, giving him time to see the ranch begin to prosper under his daughter's management. Vaughn remained at the Summers ranch, ostensibly as the foreman, though everyone in Nogales knew his relationship with Abigail went beyond employer and employee. They maintained separate quarters, Abigail in the main house and Vaughn in the foreman's cabin, but spent most waking hours together, working side by side to rebuild the struggling ranch into a viable operation. As Abigail had feared, the Fletchers continued to make trouble where they could. Edward Fletcher called in loans to several of the businesses that traded with the Summers ranch, attempting to cut off their supplies. But Vaughn's connections with merchants in Tucson and across the border in Mexico provided alternative sources for what they needed. More concerning was Harold Fletcher's increasingly erratic behavior. He'd taken to drinking heavily and was often seen in town making threats against Vaughn and Abigail. Sheriff Davis had warned him multiple times, but with his father's influence still significant in the small community, there were limits to what the law could do. One cool October evening, Abigail sat beside her father's bed, reading to him from one of his favorite books. Thomas seemed more alert than usual, his blue eyes so like Abigail's own, following her movements with clarity that had been absent in recent days. "Enough reading," he said finally, his voice weak but determined. "I want to talk to you about Keller." Abigail closed the book, setting it on the bedside table. "What about him? You love him." It wasn't a question. She didn't deny it. Over the months, her feelings for Vaughn had deepened from attraction and gratitude into something profound and enduring. "Yes," she admitted, "I do." "Then why haven't you married him?" Thomas asked, frustration evident despite his weakness. "I won't live to see spring, Abigail. I'd like to see you settled before I go." Abigail smiled softly, taking her father's thin hand in hers. "I am settled, Papa. The ranch is doing well. I have good people working for me. I don't need to marry for security or protection. Not even for love." "Love doesn't require marriage papers to be real," she replied. "Vaughn and I have time." Thomas shook his head slightly. "Time is never guaranteed, daughter. I thought I had years left with your mother when consumption took her in months." He squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "Don't waste what happiness you can find in this life. It's precious and too easily lost." Abigail considered her father's words, recognizing the wisdom in them. She and Vaughn hadn't discussed marriage again after that night on the porch, both content to let their relationship develop naturally, without pressure. But she knew he was waiting for her to be ready to be certain that her choice came from love and not from practical considerations. "I'll think about it, Papa," she promised. "Now rest. You've tired yourself with all this matchmaking." Thomas smiled weakly, his eyes already drifting closed. "Stubborn girl," he murmured affectionately, "just like your mother." Later that evening, Abigail found Vaughn in the barn, checking on a mare that was close to foaling. The lantern light cast warm shadows across his features as he straightened at her approach. "How's your father?" he asked, closing the stall door quietly. "Resting now. He was more lucid today than he's been in weeks." She hesitated, then added, "He asked about us, about why we haven't married." Vaughn's expression remained neutral, but she saw the flicker of interest in his eyes. "What did you tell him?" "That we have time." She moved closer, drawn to his steady presence. "But he reminded me that time isn't always as plentiful as we think." Vaughn nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Your father is a wise man." "Sometimes," she agreed with a small smile. "He's also an impatient man who wants to see his daughter settled before he dies." "And what does his daughter want?" Vaughn asked softly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. The simple touch sent warmth coursing through her. After months of working together, of quiet conversations and stolen kisses, of gradually building trust and understanding, Abigail knew her heart with certainty. "I want you," she said simply. "Not because I need protection or because the ranch needs a man to run it. Not because I'm grateful for what you did for my family, but because I love you, Vaughn Keller, and I can't imagine my life without you in it." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Are you proposing to me, Miss Summers?" he asked, his voice light but his eyes serious. "I suppose I am," she replied with a laugh. "Is that terribly improper?" "Terribly," he agreed, pulling her into his arms. But then, you've never been one to follow convention, have you? His kiss was tender and unhurried, a promise of all the days to come. When they finally broke apart, Abigail rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "We should wait until spring," she murmured. "After the winter and after." She couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. Vaughn understood. "After your father," he said gently. "Of course. There's no rush, Abigail. I'm not going anywhere." A sudden commotion outside interrupted their moment. Shouting voices and the sound of horses approaching at speed sent them both hurrying to the barn door. In the yard, several riders had arrived, their lanterns casting eerie shadows across the ground. At their center was Harold Fletcher, swaying in his saddle, clearly intoxicated. "Summers," he bellowed. "Get out here, you thieving witch!" Vaughn moved to step in front of Abigail, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "No," she said firmly. "This is my ranch. I'll handle this." Squaring her shoulders, she walked out into the yard, stopping a safe distance from the mounted men. "It's late, Mr. Fletcher," she called, her voice steady despite the fear fluttering in her chest. "State your business and then leave." Harold's laugh was ugly, slurred with drink. "My business? My business is that you and that drifter stole what was mine. The water rights, the ranch." His gaze slid over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "And you?" "I was never yours," Abigail replied coldly. "And neither was this ranch. Now leave before I have Sheriff Davis arrest you for trespassing." "Sheriff's out of town," one of the other riders said with a smirk. "Won't be back till morning." Vaughn had moved to stand beside Abigail, his presence reassuring but not protective. He recognized this was her fight. "5 against 2 isn't very sporting, Fletcher," he said conversationally, though his hand rested near his holstered pistol. "Wasn't planning on sport," Harold snarled, drawing his own weapon. "Was planning on taking back what's mine." Before anyone could react further, the ranch house door opened, and Thomas Summers appeared, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his thin frame silhouetted against the lamplight from inside. "Fletcher," he called, his voice surprisingly strong. "You're trespassing on my daughter's property. I suggest you leave while you still can." Harold's attention swung to the frail figure on the porch. "Old man, you should have died months ago. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." He raised his pistol, aiming it at Thomas. Everything happened at once. Abigail screamed a warning as Vaughn drew his weapon. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Harold's gun. Fletcher tumbled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder, while his companions scattered in confusion. Miguel stood at the corner of the house, rifle still raised. "The next one goes between your eyes, Senor," he said calmly. "I suggest you take Senor Summers's advice and leave." Harold Fletcher writhed on the ground, blood seeping between his fingers where he clutched his wounded shoulder. His companions, seeing the odds had shifted, quickly lost their enthusiasm for the confrontation. "This isn't over," one of them muttered, dismounting to help Harold back onto his horse. "It is for tonight," Vaughn replied, his gun still drawn. "Take him to the doctor in town, and then all of you stay away from this ranch. Next time, Miguel might not aim for the shoulder." As the riders departed, taking a moaning Harold with them, Abigail rushed to her father, who had sunk down onto a porch chair, his brief surge of strength evaporating. "Papa, you shouldn't be out of bed," she scolded gently, checking his forehead for fever. Thomas waved away her concern. "Couldn't let that fool threaten my family," he wheezed. "Glad to see Miguel's aim is still true." Miguel approached, rifle now lowered. "I only wish I had shot him years ago when he first started causing trouble," the old ranch hand said with a shrug. "Would have saved us all some difficulty." Despite the tension of the moment, Abigail couldn't help but laugh. "Let's get you back to bed, Papa." It's been quite enough excitement for one night. As she and Vaughn helped Thomas back inside, Abigail felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear at how close they'd come to disaster, certainly, but also a fierce pride in how they'd stood together, not just she and Vaughn, but her father and Miguel as well. They were a family, bound by more than blood or legal ties. Later, after Thomas was settled and Miguel had taken up watch on the porch, Abigail and Vaughn sat at the kitchen table, mugs of coffee warming their hands. "Fletcher will be back," Vaughn said quietly. "Next time with more men better prepared." Abigail nodded. "I know, but we'll be ready too." She reached across the table to take his hand. "Tonight made me realize something, Vaughn. I don't want to wait until spring." He looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "For what? For us to be married?" She squeezed his hand. "My father was right. Time isn't guaranteed. I want whatever days we have, many or few, to be spent as husband and wife." Vaughn's face softened. "Are you sure? With everything that's happening, your father's health, Fletcher's threats?" "I'm more sure because of those things," she insisted. "Life is uncertain. The only thing I know for certain is that I love you, and I want to build a life with you starting now, not some distant future when everything is settled." Vaughn rose from his chair and came around the table, kneeling beside her just as he had that night on the porch months ago. "Abigail Summers," he said solemnly, though his eyes danced with joy, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not in the spring, not when everything is perfect, but now, imperfect as we are with all the challenges ahead of us?" "Yes," she said simply, bending to kiss him. 1,000 times yes. The wedding was arranged for the following week, a simple ceremony to be performed at the ranch. Thomas Summers rallied somewhat, determined to see his daughter married. News of the planned nuptials spread quickly through Nogales, along with word of Harold Fletcher's injury. Sheriff Davis, upon his return to town, investigated the incident but filed no charges against Miguel, ruling the shooting justified self-defense against armed trespassers. Edward Fletcher, furious at the turn of events, threatened legal action but found little support. His son's drunken raid on the Summers ranch had cost the family much of their remaining goodwill in the community. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cool, a perfect late October day. Abigail wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Mrs. Rodriguez, the wife of one of their ranch hands. Thomas, too weak to stand for long, was settled in a comfortable chair near the improvised altar, a simple arch decorated with autumn wildflowers and ribbons. With no local minister available on short notice, they had planned for Judge Wilson from Tucson to perform the ceremony. But as the guests gathered, neighboring ranchers, townspeople who had stood by them against the Fletchers, and the ranch hands and their families, word came that the judge's wagon had broken down 10 miles outside of town. He would be delayed by several hours at least. "What do we do?" Abigail asked, trying to hide her disappointment. Her father had been growing weaker by the day, and she feared he might not be able to stay awake for a delayed ceremony. Vaughn, handsome in a clean black suit that Miguel had pressed meticulously, considered the problem. "We could wait," he said slowly, "or we could proceed in our own way." "Without an officiant?" she asked, confused. "In some territories, a marriage by declaration is recognized as legal. We state our intentions before witnesses, sign a document, and file it with the county clerk later." Thomas, overhearing from his chair, nodded approval. "It was common during the war when ministers weren't always available. If you two are committed to each other, the lack of an official blessing shouldn't matter." Abigail looked at the gathered friends and family, at her ailing father who had rallied his remaining strength for this day, and at Vaughn, steady, patient Vaughn, who had waited for her to be ready, who had never pushed or demanded. "Let's do it," she decided. "I don't want to wait another minute to be your wife." Word spread quickly through the assembled guests. Some of the older, more traditional women whispered concerns about propriety, but most seemed charmed by the romantic notion of a declaration marriage. As the guests gathered in a circle around them, Vaughn took Abigail's hands in his. In place of a minister's words, they simply spoke their promises directly to each other. "I, Vaughn Keller, take you, Abigail Summers, as my lawful wife," he began, his voice clear and unwavering. "I promise to love and cherish you, to stand beside you in all things, to respect your independence even as we build a life together, until death parts us." Abigail's voice trembled slightly as she repeated similar words, adding her own promise. "I will be your partner in all things, your equal in our home and in our work, your comfort in sorrow and your companion in joy." Miguel stepped forward with a document. He and Vaughn had prepared a simple statement declaring their marriage, with spaces for their signatures and those of witnesses. As they signed, Thomas Summers watched with tears in his eyes, his face peaceful in a way Abigail hadn't seen since before her mother's death. When the document was signed by both of them, and by Thomas and Miguel as witnesses, Vaughn turned to the assembled guests. "The marriage was signed in silence," he announced, his arm around Abigail's waist. "And as this cowboy will tell you, love don't need a witness." A cheer went up from the crowd and the celebration began in earnest. Mrs. Rodriguez and the other women had prepared a feast, and someone brought out a fiddle. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Abigail moved through the gathering, accepting congratulations and well wishes, always aware of Vaughn nearby, his gaze finding hers across the yard time and again. Thomas Summers lasted until sunset before exhaustion claimed him. As Abigail helped him back to his room, he squeezed her hand weakly. "I can go peacefully now," he whispered, "knowing you've found your way." "Papa, don't talk like that," she protested. "You'll be with us for a while yet." But they both knew it wasn't true. Thomas Summers died peacefully in his sleep 3 days later, having lived just long enough to see his daughter married to a man worthy of her. The winter that followed was one of both grief and joy for Abigail. The loss of her father left an ache that even Vaughn's love couldn't completely heal, but the comfort of having him beside her made the pain bearable. Together they weathered the season's hardships, a particularly cold January that threatened the cattle herds, continued legal harassment from Edward Fletcher, though Harold had disappeared, reportedly to San Francisco to recover from his wound, and the normal challenges of ranch life. By spring, the Summers Keller Ranch, as it was now known locally, had established itself as one of the more prosperous operations in the region. Vaughn's expertise with horses had expanded their business beyond cattle, bringing an additional income through breeding and training quality mounts for the cavalry at Fort Huachuca, and for wealthy ranchers throughout the territory. One warm evening in April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a daily ritual they'd established in their married life, Abigail leaned against Vaughn's shoulder with a contented sigh. "I have some news," she said casually, though her heart raced with excitement. "Oh." Vaughn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Good news, I hope, the best kind." She turned to face him, taking in the features that had become so dear to her, the gray eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the thin scar along his jawline, the streaks of silver beginning to appear in his dark hair. "Dr. Havers confirmed it today. We're going to have a baby." The joy that spread across Vaughn's face was everything she'd hoped for. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "When?" "Late November, the doctor thinks." She smiled up at him. just in time for winter." Vaughn shook his head in amazement. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "A home, a wife, a child. After the war, I was so lost, so hollow inside. I couldn't imagine belonging anywhere to anyone." "And now," she prompted, stroking his cheek. "Now I belong to you," he said simply. "And you belong to me, not as possessions but as parts of each other's souls." The setting sun bathed them in golden light as they sat together, planning their future and that of the child who would join them, a future built on a foundation of choice and love, of respect and partnership, of promises made not before God or the law but to each other, from their hearts. The following November, as the first winter storms gathered over the mountains, Abigail gave birth to a healthy son they named Thomas Miguel Keller, honoring both her father and the man whose intervention had brought them together. As Vaughn held his son for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his face, Abigail watched them with a heart so full it seemed impossible to contain such happiness. "What are you thinking?" Vaughn asked, noticing her expression. "I'm thinking about that day last year when you rode into our yard and changed everything." She reached out to touch her son's tiny hand. "If Miguel hadn't written to you, if you hadn't come, I would have found you somehow," Vaughn said with quiet certainty. "Some souls are meant to find each other, no matter what stands in their way." Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, but inside the ranch house that had once felt like a prison to Abigail, warmth and love prevailed. The path that had brought them here hadn't been easy or direct, but as she looked at her husband cradling their newborn son, Abigail knew it had been the right one. Their marriage certificate, that simple document signed without official blessing, hung framed on the wall, a reminder that sometimes the most binding commitments were those made from the heart, witnessed not by authority but by love itself. And in the years that followed, as their family grew to include a daughter 2 years later and another son 2 years after that, as the ranch prospered, and their reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock spread throughout the territory, Vaughn and Abigail Keller remained each other's strongest advocates and deepest loves. They weathered the challenges that came Edward Fletcher's continued attempts to undermine them until his death in 1885. Drought years that threatened their herds, the normal trials of raising children and building a life in the still wild Arizona territory. Through it all, they faced each obstacle as they had from the beginning, side by side, equal partners bound by choice rather than convention. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1903, with their children grown and the ranch thriving under their continued guidance, they renewed their vows, this time with a proper minister, their children and grandchildren in attendance, and a community that had come to respect and admire them gathered to celebrate. As they stood together under the same arch where they had first declared their commitment, now weathered but still standing, Vaughn leaned close to whisper in Abigail's ear, "Would you do it all again? The same way?" Abigail, her hair now streaked with silver but her blue eyes as bright as ever, smiled up at the man who had taught her the true meaning of partnership. "Without hesitation," she replied. "Every moment, every struggle, every joy, I would choose you again and again." As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, a formality that merely confirmed what had been true for a quarter-century, Vaughn and Abigail exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Their love had been born in the midst of conflict, had flourished against the odds, and had endured through challenges that would have broken lesser bonds. And it had all begun with a declaration made in the presence of loved ones, without official sanction but with the deepest commitment, a marriage signed in silence, with a cowboy's simple truth: love don't need a witness,